All right, so we're diving into fruit from a poisonous tree today. You know, the one you wanted to unpack.
Yeah.
About government overreach, monetary systems, all that.
Yeah.
So it's Melvin Stamper, right? A former judge.
Well, former judge, yeah.
Which, you know, kind of lends some weight to his arguments, I think.
He does.
He's making some pretty bold claims saying the U.S. government's basically set up to, like, strip citizens of their wealth and freedom.
And what I find really interesting is he's not just throwing out these big ideas, you know?
Mm-hmm.
He actually uses, like, historical examples and legal precedents to support his arguments.
Oh, okay. So we're not talking about just some random conspiracy theory rant here.
No, not at all. I mean, he even goes into specific sections of laws, like the Patriot Act,
Oh, wow.
to illustrate his concerns.
Okay, so there's actual substance to what he's saying.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Like, one of the things that really caught my attention was when he compared, modern-day America to pre-war Nazi Germany.
Whoa. Okay,
I know, it sounds extreme.
that's a pretty heavy comparison.
It is, but he uses it to show the similarities between, things like asset forfeiture laws that we have in the U.S.
Oh.
and the kind of tactics they were using back then.
So he's saying both are targeting individual liberties and property rights, even if they're doing it in different ways.
Exactly. It's about how those in power can manipulate systems to, gain control over individuals.
I can see how that would get people thinking. But how does he tie all this back to his main argument about the whole U.S. system being rigged?
Well, he breaks it down systematically. He starts with this section called the Transformation of America.
Okay.
And he argues that the shift, from a republic to a democracy
Right.
has actually led to more power being concentrated in the federal government.
And he sees that as a bad thing.
He does, yeah,
Yeah.
because he thinks it's led to this erosion of individual liberties.
Okay.
And he believes this shift has really benefited what he calls the global elite.
Like who? What does he mean by that?
He's talking about international bankers, powerful individuals, the kind of people who are always pulling the strings behind the scenes.
Oh, okay.
He thinks they're the ones who are really benefiting from this concentration of power, and they're seeking to control, the nation's wealth and resources.
So it's like by becoming a democracy, we've actually become less free.
That's his argument, yeah. It definitely challenges the traditional narrative about democracy, right?
It does.
Yeah.
It's funny because that kind of plays into this fear a lot of people have.
Oh, absolutely.
Like losing their individual freedoms to some big, faceless entity.
It's a very real fear.
Yeah. And it sounds like that fear is at the core of his next point, which is the erosion of the Constitution.
Right.
I'm guessing the Patriot Act makes a big appearance here.
Oh, yeah. The Patriot Act is front and center. He sees it as like a prime example of how the Constitution has been weakened.
In what way?
Well, he argues that things like, warrantless searches and indefinite detention of immigrants,
Right.
those violate core constitutional protections.
So is he saying the Patriot Act is straight up unconstitutional?
He's definitely challenging its legitimacy.
I see.
He even points to specific sections, like Section 802, which is really interesting.
What does that one say?
It basically criminalizes anything that could be seen as trying to, quote, influence the policy of the government by intimidation or coercion.
That's, pretty vague, isn't it?
Extremely vague.
Yeah.
And that's exactly his point.
Oh, I see what he's getting at.
He argues that this kind of language could be used to suppress any kind of dissent or protest,
Even peaceful ones.
even peaceful ones. Yeah, he's concerned about the potential chilling effect on free speech.
Wow, that is a disturbing thought.
Yeah,
So does he offer any solutions, any ways to fight back against this?
he does, and this is where things get even more interesting. He goes into the 14th Amendment, but not in the way you might think.
Oh, how hell.
He calls it the 14th Amendment, a shift in power.
Okay.
He claims it created this dual legal system where individual rights are basically subordinate to the police power of the state.
Wait, so the 14th Amendment is a bad thing, according to him.
That's how he interprets it, yeah.
I thought it was about equality for all citizens,
It is, but he focuses on the naturalization clause.
which is...
It's the part that he believes makes everyone born in America a federal citizen at birth, and therefore subject to the jurisdiction of the federal government right from the start.
Okay, I'm following. But where's he going with this?
Here's the kicker. He argues that by participating in the current political system,
Right, by voting.
exactly, by voting, paying taxes, all that, we're essentially consenting to this subordinate status and giving up our inherent common law rights.
Hold on, so he's saying voting makes you less free.
That's his argument, yeah.
I don't know about that one. Can you explain how he even gets to that conclusion?
Well, he sees the 14th Amendment, as he interprets it, as creating this legal framework where the federal government has more power over individuals.
Okay.
And by participating in the system, we're essentially agreeing to play by its rules, even if we don't realize it.
I mean, that's a very specific interpretation, to say the least.
It is. It's definitely controversial.
Okay, so if participating in the system is actually bad, according to him, what are we supposed to do? Just boycott elections?
Well, that's where his next argument comes in, and this one you might have heard before.
What's that?
It's all about the Federal Reserve.
Ah, here we go.
He calls it the Federal Reserve, a private entity controlling the nation's wealth.
Does he buy into that whole shadowy banking cartel thing?
Let's just say he doesn't shy away from that kind of language.
Okay.
He argues that the Federal Reserve isn't really a government institution at all, but more like a private banking cartel. And they have way too much power over the U.S. economy.
I mean, a lot of people say that.
Right, but he's especially critical of the fractional reserve banking system.
What's that?
It's, well, it's complicated, but basically banks only need to hold a fraction of the deposits they receive.
Okay.
The rest they can lend out, and that creates new money.
I'm with you so far.
Stamper argues that this system leads to this never-ending cycle of debt.
Interesting.
He actually tells this fictional story about early fractional reserve banking.
Oh, really?
Yeah, to show how easily it can be exploited.
So it's like a warning about what happens when a few people have too much control over money.
Exactly. He uses this story to highlight how flawed the system is.
And he thinks that's still happening today.
Absolutely. He believes it benefits a small elite at the expense of everyone else.
Okay, so he's making some pretty big claims. Does he have any evidence to back this up?
He does, and this is where he really starts to challenge what we think we know about money.
In what way?
His next section is called The Illusion of Money. And he basically argues that the dollars we use every day,
Yeah.
they're not actually real money.
What? If dollars aren't real money, then what are they?
He says they're just debt instruments, backed by nothing of real value.
Okay, I'm officially lost now.
He's saying the whole system is built on, like, smoke and mirrors.
Whoa.
The Federal Reserve creates money out of thin air and then charges interest on it.
That's a pretty radical idea, I've got to say.
It is, but he brings it down to earth with examples like getting a mortgage.
How does that work?
He shows how the system puts individuals at a disadvantage because they're constantly in debt.
So we're trapped.
That's what he's suggesting. So if the system is rigged against us, what do we do about it?
Yeah, I mean, is he saying we should go back to bartering or something?
Not quite. He has a much more, let's say, radical solution.
Oh, okay.
He ties back to what we were talking about earlier about individual sovereignty.
Right. That's the stuff that gets a little tricky.
It definitely does.
Yeah.
But before we get into that, maybe we should take a breather and just process everything we've covered so far.
Yeah, that's probably a good idea. What do you think so far? Anything standing out to you?
I mean, it's a lot to take in. He's painting a very specific picture of how power and finance work in America.
And it's not exactly a pretty picture.
No, it's not. But even if we set aside some of his more dramatic claims, there's still a lot to think about.
Yeah, like that thing about fractional reserve banking. That was actually pretty insightful.
Absolutely, even if you don't buy into the whole we're slaves to debt thing.
Right. Just understanding how money is created and how the banking system works, that's valuable on its own.
Totally. It helps you make better financial decisions for yourself, you know.
Definitely. Okay, so back to this whole individual sovereignty thing. What is that exactly?
It's the idea that individuals can exist outside the jurisdiction of the federal government.
So basically like sovereign citizens.
You're catching on. But that movement, you know, it's associated with some pretty fringe legal theories.
Yeah, I've heard some stories.
He actually suggests some pretty unorthodox strategies.
Like what?
Things like filing UCC-1 financing statements.
What are those usually used for?
It's usually for commercial transactions, but he thinks individuals can use them to assert ownership over their legal persona.
That sounds like a recipe for disaster, if you ask me.
Yeah, I wouldn't recommend trying that without talking to a real lawyer first.
Yeah, sure. So what else does he say about this sovereignty stuff?
He goes even further, encouraging people to challenge the whole legitimacy of the Federal Reserve.
Oh.
And even suggesting they seek remedies for what he sees as, like, financial fraud committed against them.
That's pretty extreme, isn't it?
It is, and it highlights a major tension in his book, you know.
Yeah.
He wants to empower individuals, but his methods are often outside the bounds of established law.
It's like he's offering a solution that could create more problems than it solves.
Right. So where does he go from there?
Yeah, does he have any other suggestions for fighting back against this system he hates so much?
He does, and it builds on this theme he's been developing all along.
Which is?
The dangers of unchecked government power.
Okay.
He has a whole section called The Perils of Emergency Powers.
What's that about?
He argues that the U.S. has basically been operating under a state of emergency since 1933.
1933, that was forever ago.
I know, right? But he's talking about the national emergency declared during the Great Depression,
Go.
which gave the president all these extra powers.
Right.
And he claims it was never really revoked.
So, we're still in a state of emergency. After all these years?
That's what he's saying.
That's kind of freaky.
It is. And he points to various historical events to back this up.
Like what?
Things like the suspension of habeas corpus during the Civil War.
Right.
And the military tribunals set up after 9/11.
Yeah.
He uses those as examples of how emergency powers can be abused.
Okay, so he's saying those things could happen again.
He argues that the legal framework is still in place, which is worrying.
Yeah, I can see that. So, if we're living in this permanent state of emergency, what can we do about it?
In his final section, a call to action, he urges readers to learn about their rights and resist government overreach.
Okay, that makes sense.
But he goes beyond just peaceful protest and civic engagement.
He does. What does he suggest?
He implies that if those things don't work, the American people might have to take more drastic measures.
Like what? Is he talking about violence?
He doesn't explicitly endorse it, but the idea of revolution is definitely there.
Okay, so we've gone from comparing America to Nazi Germany to questioning the Federal Reserve to potentially talking about revolution.
Yeah, his rhetoric definitely gets more intense as the book goes on.
It's a lot to absorb, that's for sure. So how do we even make sense of all this? Where do we go from here?
That's the challenge, isn't it? He throws a lot of information at you, some of it well-researched, some of it bordering on conspiracy theory.
Right.
It's important to remember that this is just one perspective, his interpretation of things.
So what should someone do if they want to learn more without getting lost in all the crazy conspiracy stuff?
That's a great question, and something we can explore further.
Yeah, let's do that.
But first, maybe we should just take stock of what we've learned from Stamper's book so far.
Yeah, good idea. What are your main takeaways? What stood out to you?
I think what really hit me was this feeling of powerlessness that runs through the whole book.
It's like we're all just stuck in this system that's working against us.
Exactly. And there's nothing we can do about it.
That's a pretty bleak outlook.
It is. But I think that's where it becomes even more important to remember that knowledge is power.
So you're saying even though Stamper paints a pretty dark picture, there's still hope?
I think so. We have more agency than we realize.
Okay.
By understanding how these systems work, we can make better choices and push for change.
Without resorting to, like, crazy revolution stuff.
Exactly. We don't have to go to extremes or embrace those fringe legal theories.
That's good to hear.
Yeah.
So what's the first step? Where do we even begin? There's so much information out there. It's hard to know what's real and what's not.
It's tough, for sure. Especially with all the misinformation online these days.
Yeah.
One thing you can do is diversify your sources.
Meaning?
Don't just rely on one book or one website. Look at different perspectives. Read academic articles. Check out reputable news sources.
So basically, don't get stuck in an echo chamber.
Exactly. You got to be willing to hear different viewpoints.
Right. And most importantly, think for yourself.
Absolutely. Don't just believe everything you read or hear.
Okay, so back to Stamper's book.
Yeah.
Should we just ignore everything he says because some of it's so out there?
I wouldn't say ignore it completely.
Yeah.
He raises some valid points about power, government, the financial system.
Okay.
But we need to be critical, you know?
Oh.
We can't just take everything he says as gospel, but we shouldn't dismiss it entirely either.
It's like finding that balance between being informed and not freaking out.
Exactly. It's about having those constructive conversations, working towards change, without getting sucked into fear and conspiracy theories.
That makes sense. And I think that's a good place to wrap up this part of our deep dive.
I agree. We've covered a lot of ground, and it's a lot to process.
So, to everyone listening, take some time to think about what we've discussed today.
Yeah. Do your own research, form your own opinions.
And we'll be back soon to delve even deeper into fruit from a poisonous tree.
Stay tuned. It's a lot to unpack, for sure.
Yeah, no kidding. I'm still trying to wrap my head around this whole 14th Amendment thing, like how it supposedly limits our freedom.
Yeah.
And this whole Federal Reserve being a private entity controlling everything.
It does sound kind of conspiracy-ish, doesn't it?
It does. But even if we ignore those parts, there's still some interesting stuff in there.
Totally. Like the way he explains fractional reserve banking,
Yeah, that was pretty eye-opening.
even if you don't believe the whole debt slavery thing.
Right. Just understanding how money works, that's important.
Absolutely. Especially these days when everything's so complicated.
So back to Stamper's solution, this individual sovereignty thing. What's the deal with that?
Basically, he wants people to see themselves as sovereign citizens.
Like above the law.
Not exactly.
Yeah.
More like outside the jurisdiction of the federal government.
I've heard of that movement.
Yeah,
It's got a bit of a reputation, doesn't it?
it does, yeah.
Yeah.
Some of their legal theories are pretty out there.
He actually suggests some specific strategies.
He does, yeah.
Like what?
Things like filing UCC-1 financing statements,
What are those for again?
usually for businesses.
Mm-hmm.
But he thinks individuals can use them too,
To do what?
to claim ownership of their legal persona.
I'm not a lawyer, but that sounds risky.
Yeah, I wouldn't try it without professional advice.
So anything else about this sovereignty thing?
He also wants people to challenge the legitimacy of the Federal Reserve,
Oh boy.
even suggesting they seek remedies for, like, financial fraud.
That seems like a slippery slope.
It is, and it shows this tension in his book, you know.
How so?
He wants to empower people, but his methods are often, well, illegal.
Yeah, it's like a solution that could create more problems.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So what else does he suggest?
Yeah, is there anything else we can do besides, becoming outlaws?
Well, he builds on this theme of government overreach.
Right.
He has this section called The Perils of Emergency Powers.
Emergency powers.
Yeah, he argues that the U.S. has been in a state of emergency since 1933.
Seriously?
He's talking about the declaration during the Great Depression,
Oh, wow.
and he claims it's never been officially ended.
So we're still in a state of emergency after all these years.
That's his argument.
That's a little unsettling.
It is. He uses historical examples to back it up.
Like what?
Things like suspending habeas corpus during the Civil War,
Okay.
or the military tribunals after 9/11.
Right.
He's saying those powers are still there, just waiting to be used.
That's kind of scary.
It is. So what do we do about it?
Well, is there any way out of this?
In his call to action, he urges people to learn about their rights
Makes sense.
and to resist government overreach.
Okay.
But he goes beyond just peaceful protest.
He does. What does he say?
He suggests that if those things don't work, more drastic measures might be necessary.
Is he talking about violence?
He doesn't say it outright, but he hints at the possibility of revolution.
Wow. Okay. So we've gone from Nazi Germany to the Federal Reserve to revolution.
It's a journey.
It is. So how do we wrap our heads around all this?
It's a lot to process, for sure.
Yeah, it is. So for anyone listening, just remember, this is just one perspective.
Absolutely. Do your own research, think critically,
Don't believe everything you read.
and don't be afraid to question things.
All right, that's some good advice. We'll be back soon to finish unpacking fruit from a poisonous tree.
See them?
It's a lot, to process. Like, I'm still kind of reeling from how much he's trying to take down.
Yeah. He's definitely going for a pretty big shift in, how we see things.
Yeah.
Our whole relationship with the government, the financial system.
Yeah, and I don't necessarily agree with everything he says, but
Of course.
he does raise some valid points, right? About how power can be misused.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
There are definitely some legitimate concerns in there.
Yeah, and I think what really stuck with me was this feeling of helplessness that comes through in the book.
Like we're just cogs in a machine we can't control.
Yeah, exactly. He's saying we're trapped in this system that's rigged against us and there's nothing we can do.
That's where I think it's so important to remember that, knowledge is power.
Okay, so even though he makes it sound pretty hopeless,
Yeah.
there's still hope.
I think so. We have more agency than we realize,
Mm-hmm.
By understanding how things work, we can make better choices.
Right.
We can advocate for change.
Okay, so we don't have to just give up and, join some crazy revolution.
No, not at all. We can work within the system to make it better.
Okay, so that's reassuring. But where do we even start?
Right. It's overwhelming.
Yeah, there's so much information out there, it's hard to know what's true.
One thing you can do is, diversify your sources. You got to get outside your comfort zone and hear what other people have to say.
And now, most importantly, think for yourself.
Absolutely. Question everything. Look for evidence. Don't just blindly believe what you read.
Okay, so back to Stamper's book. Should we just throw it out the window because some of his ideas are so out there?
I wouldn't say that. He does make some good points, about the balance of power, the role of government,
Right.
the problems with the financial system.
Okay.
But we got to be critical. We can't just take everything he says at face value.
Right, but we also shouldn't just ignore him completely.
Exactly. It's about finding that balance between staying informed and not getting swept up in the fear and the conspiracy theories.
And that's, I think, a good takeaway from this whole deep dive, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
Stamper's book, it's controversial, but it makes you think, about the systems we live under.
Yeah, it challenges us to be more aware, more engaged.
And to work towards a better future, where individual freedom and economic justice are actually real.
Exactly. Not just empty promises.
And that's what we've been trying to do here, right?
Yeah, to get people thinking, questioning things, forming their own conclusions.
So, to everyone listening, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into fruit from a poisonous tree.
Yeah, thanks for listening.
We hope this has given you some food for thought. Keep learning, keep questioning, and keep pushing for a better world.
Absolutely.
And remember, knowledge is power. Use it wisely.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Until next time, keep exploring.